we learn when we hear this story of Zacchaeus, and what does the city of Jericho teach us? Okay, let's just take a moment and look at that today. To do this, let's remember the gospel of the past 2 Sundays. 2 Sundays ago, an elderly woman, poor, approaches a judge and asks the judge to render a decision on her behalf. Of course, the judge respects neither God nor man, so really does not care what this woman says. But obviously, she's persistent. And after a while, even a man, everyone, this judge, who doesn't care about her, about any man, or even God, gives in and renders a judgment on her behalf. So what do we learn here? God rewards persistence. Last Sunday, you heard the story about 2 people in a temple area. They're praying. One was a Pharisee. Remember, he comes in and he says, Lord, I'm grateful that I'm not like everybody else. You or you or you or you or you. You're an adulterer. You're greedy. You lie. Me, I pay my tithe and I obey the commandments. Meanwhile, a tax collector, hint, hint, today, Zacchaeus, comes in, bows his head, and simply says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. In the end, who does Jesus commend? Well, it isn't the Pharisee. It is everyone, of course, the tax collector. Both of those stories will become important now as we look a little closer at Zacchaeus. For us to get to Jericho, though, we realize today's gospel is the first story in Luke's 19th chapter. But let's go back 2 stories. Because 2 stories ago, Jesus is on his way now. When we get to the end of Luke's 18th chapter, he's bringing his disciples now to Jericho. And if you actually look on a map, Jericho is here and Jerusalem is here. So they're getting close. Coming. Okay? On his way, he turns to his disciples and he tells them, the Son of Man, we're going to Jerusalem. I will suffer, be handed over to the Gentiles. I will be crucified, and 3 days later, I will rise. And he looks at them, and they have a blank stare on their face. They don't get it. Okay? Now, in the very last story of the 18th chapter of Luke's Gospel, we hear the story about a famous man whose name is Bartimaeus. This story now occurs just outside of Jericho. Chronology here. On his way to Jericho, Jesus addresses his disciples. Now they're outside of Jericho, and this blind man named Bartimaeus hears all the commotion. And he asks, what's going on? And he's told, Jesus is coming. And he yells out, Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me. And you know your response to the crowd was, to Bartimaeus? They told him, be quiet. Shut up. But Bartimaeus doesn't. He yells out all the more, and I want to emphasize this point. Imagine the crowd that's with Jesus and the noise and how loud Bartimaeus has to yell. But he yells out, Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me. Jesus stops, calls him over, says, what do you want? And he says, Jesus, I want to see. And what does Jesus do? He restores his sight. And what does Bartimaeus do? He gets in line now and he follows Jesus Christ. Persistence. Now we come to Luke's 19th chapter. But before we do that, remember the story now of the woman and the judge. God rewards persistence. In the story of Bartimaeus, it is only because he's persistent that Jesus hears. We learn now that Jesus rewards persistence. Now you hear today's gospel. Now they're in Jericho. Okay? What was the handicap of Bartimaeus? He couldn't see. What is the handicap of Zacchaeus? He's too short. Okay? Now, if I was to go around the church and ask you, in the midst of this big crowd, what will your handicap be? I don't know. But it's something for you to think about. Okay, and as we hear these stories, notice how crafty people become to see Jesus. Okay? Of course, Zacchaeus can't see. And so what does he have to do? He has to compensate. I want to share with you a little story just so we get an idea of what it means when we talk about compensating. I used to fish with a man in another parish. And whenever I went in his boat, he had plenty of rods and reels and he had plenty of tackle. So there was no need for me to bring all of my stuff along as well. But he was left-handed when he turned the crank on a reel. I was right-handed. Okay? And with these current day reels, with most of them, you simply take out a screw and you can change the crank, the handle from one side to the next. So whenever I got into his boat, take the screw out, I'd remove it from the left side, put it in the right side, put the screw back in, and away we go. Okay? And whenever I was done, just out of respect, I always tried to remember to turn that crank, that handle, back to the left side. But once in a while, I would forget. So one winter, he got an ingenious idea. Took a rod, he broke the rod basically right off. On it was a reel, and the crank was on the left side. And he gave it to me and he said, "This is yours, but what I want you to do over the winter time now is I want you to practice with your left hand and see what you can do by spring." So I did. I set it by my chair. From time to time, I'd pick it up, everyone, and I'd reel it. And lo and behold, by springtime, I became left-handed. As a matter of fact, now, if I was to try to crank with the right hand, I'd feel uncomfortable. Even he was shocked at how I had learned to compensate. Now, if you think about the story of Bartimaeus, and you can't see, I'm not going to ask you this, but if you actually closed your eyes for 5 minutes, and I were to ask you, well, how are you going to compensate? The answer is, you become attuned to hearing, you become attuned with your sense of touch, and how you can feel. You know, you're going to be pretty careful on where you step. Okay? Now, how does Zacchaeus compensate? Well, he's an old enough man that he really doesn't care what you think. Okay? And the people don't like him. They don't like him to such a point that they won't let him see Jesus. So imagine this. Here's a wealthy man, a cheat, a tax collector, in his expensive clothes. And what does he do? He climbs a tree. And because of that, Jesus can see him. And he calls him down and says, "Zacchaeus, I want to eat with you tonight." He eats. And the rest of the story is something that you know. So what do we learn from Jericho? First thing we learn is this. Salvation is to all people. It doesn't matter your physical stature, your financial condition, your spiritual condition. Jesus wants to save everybody. In both stories, the crowd grumbles. But Jesus doesn't care. He wants everybody saved. And the second thing that we learn, everyone, is we come back to that word of persistence. Okay? Think about if Bartimaeus hadn't yelled, Jesus would have never heard it. Zacchaeus hadn't climbed the tree, Jesus would have never seen him. Okay? Thus, don't be lazy, passive. We're called to be persistent. That's our call. So thus, as is true every one of our spiritual life, to our faith life, be persistent. Okay? So let's pray for that, everyone, as we now turn our attention. Luke's Gospel now, we're going to leave Jericho, and we're going to come to Jerusalem. We're going to hear more and more of that story before the first Sunday of Advent. But in that, be persistent. Pray for everybody. during this month of November, we remember All Souls, but salvation is for all. Okay? Let's keep that as our prayer as we celebrate our Mass today.